Hello, listeners. This is Kat. Welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the reading of a fic entitled The Itch. Here's the summary. Abuse was built up over the years, straining hard against Midoriya's psyche until it began to crack. One more hit from Bakugo was all it took to break him, with only the worst possible person to empathize with him and teach him what he needed to know of how to finally make that itch go away. This fic is just over 16,000 words with 5 chapters. Here's chapter 1. Abuse, it seemed, was much like exercise. It hurts at first, feeling it, experiencing it, until one grew used to it. Train the mind and body to adapt and overcome and be able to take more and more without feeling, well, anything. Midoriya could remember a time when it hurt so much, back when it was still fresh. His best friend and closest companion would say something mean that would break his little heart, would push him down and leave a scrape or a bruise and leave him too stunned to cry. Soon, he got used to it. He would let insults pass over him, pick himself right back up after being pushed, and continue to pursue Katsuki Bakugo. And like any good exercise routine, upping the ante with the abuse became necessary for points to get across. Insults became more cutting and personal. Pushes and shoves became punches and kicks. Brush it off. Get back up. Rinse and repeat for another 10 years. Through it all, Midoriya could feel swells of emotions, so bitter it made him choke, and he forced it down, burying it with shame. This wasn't him, he rationalized to himself. He wasn't a hateful, bitter person. He was just a useless, quirkless, worthless, good-for-nothing Deku. Bury it all. Salt the earth. Don't let it out. Smile. He was better than this, and it was better this way. Keep being kind. Don't lash back, and Kachen would stop yelling at him. Would stop hurting him. Every time he thought about it, old phantom wounds, places where Bakugo had hit him, kicked him, or burned, would itch. He used to think about it a lot, to the point where his mother would look over and see him scratching at his shoulder while trying to focus on homework. She would find no scabs or abrasions or sign of disease, but Midoriya still had to convince her not to make an appointment with the doctor, internally cursing himself for making her worry. So he trained himself out of thinking about it. Bury that away, too. Salt the earth. Smile. Rinse and repeat. He gets into UA, and Bakugo corners him, slams him against the wall, and punches his shoulder after Midoriya stands up for himself for once. After he leaves, Midoriya rubs his chest where he was punched. It itched. Bury it, bury it, bury it. After their first mock battle, his left arm still burns even after a full recovery kiss from Recovery Girl, his fatigue making his mental training slip and remembering everything Bakugo had yelled at him in the simulation. It itched. So bad. Bury it. Salt it. Bury it. Thankfully, a reprieve after that. It made the sports festival, his internship, and even staying seem like a mental vacation. His smile felt lighter, his body following suit without a care or an itch to the world. All up to the midterm exam. And then, Midoriya, you will be paired with Bakugo. The rest of Aizawa's statement, and All Might's entrance, was fuzzed out with mental static. His whole body itched when Bakugo glared at him. He fought back the itching and forced himself to watch the other matches. His was dead last, and while he didn't have the opportunity to convene with Bakugo about a strategy, he could at least think of one himself. Little by little, the matches wound up, clock ticking down to his own as the swell in his chest got larger, the static louder, and the itching stronger. Finally, it was his turn. With years of practice, Midoriya fought back the anxiety that buzzed under his skin and the pounding in his heart, heading to ground beta for his exam. As he stepped closer, seeing Bakugo's back in the short distance, he forced himself to not recognize his anxiety reaching peak levels. He forced himself to not acknowledge the phantom pain of every blow the past 10 years inflicted onto his body by the other boy. His fists clenched, forcing them to stay connected in an attempt to disregard the almost painful itching sensation over his heart. Bakugo turned his head and glared at him. He really itched. The exam began. Talking a mile a minute forced the itching away he had come to find over the years. Mumble over the itching, drown the demands out. He did the same here, attempting to reason with Bakugo as a last-ditch effort. "Stop following me!" Midoriya reflexively flinched. That tone and volume level were indication of pain ahead. But this was an exam. It wasn't even graded so much as a pass-fail. And for once, Midoriya just wanted to collaborate without a fight. He swallowed down his fear and anxiety, though he felt his patience begin to strain. If we keep going straight, All Might will be right there waiting for us. We need to find a detour. Why the fuck should I avoid him? Bakugo snapped, keeping his pace and not deigning to look at Midoriya. We need to avoid direct battle at all cost, Midoriya pleaded back. Kachan! I'll toy around with him until he's tired, and then I'll blast his ass out. Bakugo snarled, fist tightening. Midoriya's patience thinned even further, his anxiety simmering right at the top, at the idea of actually having full contact battle with All Might. Just who do you think we're fighting, Kachan? It's All Might. Even with the handicap he has, you can't even hope to beat him. He didn't even see Bakugo turn around until the boy's gauntlet was smashed into his face, sending him flying back into the road. Midoriya was hardly aware he was on the road until the pain finally crashed into him, the sensation of blood dripping from his nose, trickling in through the pain. His hand shakily raised to his face, which was transitioning from impact pain to static numbness that spread over his entire head, rendering him almost deaf and blind to it. Even so, through the static, he could hear Bakugo speaking. Not another goddamn word, you shit. Just because things are going good for you doesn't mean that you should speak to me. Words literally spat from his mouth down to Midoriya, permeating his thoughts lower than the dirt Midoriya had buried a decade's worth of feeling deep down, unearthing it all in a foulness that almost made Midoriya retch in how badly it had aged over the years. The memories were almost tangible, like pieces of rotted corpses of the past, permeating everything in a way Midoriya couldn't ignore, couldn't rebury. Deku. Freak. Quirkless. Worthless. Take a swan dive off a roof and pray for a quirk in your next life. No more. No more. Stop. Please. Stop. No more. Please. Please stop. No more. No more. Midoriya crawled over the road aimlessly, like a blinded dog run over, unable to breathe from the hit he'd taken that unearthed everything he'd tried to keep buried. Shallow, retching breaths soaked with tears, pouring from his eyes as he dragged his worthless carcass away, digging his fingers into the road to keep from scratching. His whole body, everything, was one big itch. He retched again, scraping the side of his face against the street as he crawled, trying and failing to make the itch stop. A shock wave of air sent him tumbling back further from where he had started the exam. His body crashing against a parked model car, he couldn't register pain, only the desire to make the itching stop. No exam, no Kachan, no All Might. Only the thought of getting rid of it all drove him to keep crawling away, past the ache in his body, past the cut on his face from smashing into the side mirror of the model car, past the distant, unmistakable boom of All Might's voice carrying across the entire field. His encompassing itch flared more violently, halting his escape in order for him to retch again, this time coming up with what very little he had to eat earlier, as his gloved hands began clawing at his clothes in earnest. Make it stop, make it stop, make it stop, 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 stop. He began crying out in a mixture of pain and anger, his voice strained from retching and constriction that locked his body up in a fit of itching. Frustration clawed further into his brain at being unable to fix it, scraping his face and body against the street more violently since his gloved hands weren't doing him any favors. More tears poured from his eyes, and anxiety strangled him again as the suffocation of being enveloped by the unrelenting itching began to close in on him. And when he felt hands on him, all hell broke loose. Everyone in the observation room all gave a collective wince in sympathy pain when they saw Bakugo backhand Midoriya full force with his gauntlet, murmuring among one another about Midoriya's misfortune at having to work with Bakugo in the first place and wondering what form of a strategy they could even utilize to go up against All Might himself. While the students speculated, Recovery Girl's brow furrowed when she saw Midoriya remain on the ground, squinting and pressing a button to zoom in the camera for a closer look. Midoriya's eyes suddenly glazed over and looked entirely not all there, his chest and shoulders lurching like he was dry-heaving as his hands began bracing to crawl in the opposite direction that Bakugo was headed. He wasn't even pulling himself up. She saw, worry beginning to gnaw alarmingly fast up her spine. Midoriya was literally crawling away, scraping his body along the ground as his shoulders and back continued to heave. A hit to the face couldn't have possibly done something to warrant this, she rationalized, her hand reaching for the emergency stop button on the simulation at the same time that All Might punched a shockwave into the arena. All Might, emergency ceasefire, she shouted into the comm used exclusively for emergency stops, her eyes widening when she saw Midoriya crash headfirst into a model car. She stood up quickly, grabbing her medical kit and pulling up other teachers. Everyone get to field beta immediately. We have an emergency. She turned to Ida. Ida, get me there as quickly as you can. Ida didn't ask questions, immediately scooping her up and taking off, running for the field. Recovery girl, what's the cause for a ceasefire? All Might demanded from his comm, having had to use a forceful tone with Bakugo to get the boy to stop when the emergency alarm called for it. It's Midoriya, Recovery girl said quickly. Can't be sure how or why until I get there, but something's seriously wrong with him. Try to keep him from moving and hurting himself until I get there. She paused. And keep Bakugo away. What? Just do it, boy. All Might winced at the volume of her voice and his earpiece, turning to Bakugo. Young Bakugo, stay here, he commanded. We're under an emergency halt to the exam. We'll let you know what's going on later. He left the boy where he was and ran up the street pathway toward the entrance of the field, feeling his non-existent stomach lurch when he saw Midoriya sprawled on the ground, writhing on it and scraping his body against the rough asphalt as though in pain. His worry didn't abate when he saw a smear trail of blood, starting from a dented model car, lead to where the boy currently was. Young Midoriya, he called over before reaching him and kneeling down, fighting down his panic to assess the situation carefully. There was only a cut on Midoriya's head that he could see, and he knew that head wounds bleed more without being very serious as a rule, and saw that nothing on Midoriya looked particularly broken in any way, nothing that could warrant the boy acting this way. An unseen head injury came to mind, which did nothing for his worrying. He honestly didn't know how he would make Midoriya stop scraping himself against the asphalt without further injuring himself. To make matters worse, Midoriya was crying and making sounds like a strangled animal, all while making no indication that he was aware that All Might was there. Young Midoriya, please, All Might murmured, reaching out to at least unhook Midoriya's clawing fingers from his own arm, lest he cause some muscle damage. But the moment his hand touched Midoriya's shoulder, he was assaulted with the sound of screaming. Not normal pain screaming, or even angry screaming. It was strangled and inhuman, accompanied by Midoriya's arm lashing out with enough force to knock All Might back before the boy began clawing at the ground to crawl away in an apparent escape. All Might righted himself and scrambled after the boy, calling out for him to please stop moving and injuring himself before looking up to see Ida running in with Recovery Girl in his arms. The other boy skidded to a halt to put Recovery Girl down before rushing over to Midoriya despite the woman's call of warning. Young Ida! Midoriya, what's happening? Ida cried, reaching out for his friend, and not half a moment later suddenly being violently assaulted by the other boy. Midoriya had seen the hand lurched out toward its owner, feeling a decade's worth of rage flaring up and breaking out as he attacked back against his supposed aggressor. He grabbed, he clawed, he hit, he punched, screaming like a man possessed until stronger hands grabbed him and pulled him away. Hold him! Recovery Girl shouted over Midoriya screaming, unable to get closer with Midoriya being clutched, fighting, and All Might's hold like a rabid feral cat. All Might tightened his arms around Midoriya, wincing in pain as the boy clawed and slammed his fists into his arms and kicking hard against his thighs, all while the boy was screaming and retching in full psychotic breakdown. He could feel a telltale crackle of power, indicating that Midoriya was close to tapping further into One for All to do whatever it took in getting loose, and prayed wholeheartedly for Aizawa to hurry in. Prayers answered just as Midoriya reached back and almost gouged his eyes out, prompting him to let go. Midoriya pitched forward into the street, still heaving and retching as he scratched fruitlessly at his body, sobbing in rage, frustration, pain, and confusion. Aizawa jumped out of the car that Present Mike had driven up and activated his quirk toward Midoriya before snapping his capture weapon out to ensnare him. Midoriya, screaming, picked right back up as he jerked at the weapons, his muscles straining to get loose even without One for All's help. Grab him! Aizawa snapped to All Might, who held Midoriya tightly in his arms again, while Midnight hurried out, unlooping the end of her skin-tight piece with her finger. Keep his head steady, she instructed, lending a hand and helping All Might hold Midoriya's head still as she pressed her exposed hand to Midoriya's face, letting her sleeping mist do its work. Midoriya still heaved and struggled, attempting to bite her once before he began to go lax, shaking hard as sleep began overtaking him. Recovery Girl fished out a syringe of an emergency sedative, waiting for Midnight's all clear of Midoriya being out before carefully walking over and injecting it into the boy's shoulder. Midoriya went limp in All Might's hold, and the sudden jarring stillness almost made everyone too afraid to move if it meant interrupting it. Little by little, they finally moved. All Might loosened his hold around Midoriya, for Aizawa to pull his capture weapon back, while Recovery Girl was attending to Ida, who was already bruising from Midoriya's blows. She told him to stay where he was until she was sure of no immediate concussion before turning to All Might. Get him back to the school and straight to the infirmary, she commanded before turning to Aizawa. I'm sure the other children have seen more than enough through the observation room. Go keep them calm. All might scoop Midoriya up, keeping him close as he hurried back to the car, Midnight keeping close by in case the sedative failed for some reason. Aizawa helped eat upright and looked out at Bakugo, who had apparently gotten tired of waiting and followed the sound of screaming all the way back to the entrance, but remained out of the way. "Let's go, Bakugo," Aizawa said. Bakugo stalked over, looking more confused than his usual, perpetual irritated expression. "The fuck's going on?" he demanded. "We don't know." Silence. "What about the exam?" Aizawa's jaw flexed. "We'll think of something," he replied. Recovery Girl was quiet, mulling over what she had seen and not quite liking where her train of thought was going. Midoriya had only been struck by a blow that was almost a love tap by Bakugo's standards, but it somehow devolved into a full-scale psychotic fit. Whether it was quirk-related or entirely mental, neither reason would be anything to deal with. "Bakugo," she spoke up, getting the boy's attention. "Until we know what exactly is going on, do not physically or verbally engage Midoriya." Bakugo scowled. "Like I'd want to." "Bakugo!" Her tone shut him up quickly, as did the sharpness in her glare. "Do not physically or verbally engage Midoriya. Am I clear?" The boy pursed his lips as though keeping himself from making a reflexive, biting retort, and only gave a curt nod. Recovery Girl let that be, and began mentally preparing herself for the state Midoriya would be in when he would finally wake up. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 1 of The Itch. Chapter 2 will be next. Let me know your all's thoughts and reactions to this one, and as always, thank you so much for listening.